130,000 people. That's how many it's estimated died in the initial atomic blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While many more than that had already died in Tokyo before the first atomic bomb during a lesser-known event called Operation Meeting House, why didn't the United States drop a nuclear device on the capital of Japan to end the war? We'll uncover the answer to this question by following an odd series of events that resulted in one city being saved while another was reduced to radioactive rubble. And although Tokyo was not annihilated by an atomic bomb, it may have actually gone through something worse. On July 16, 1945, President Harry S. Truman was notified that the Trinity test was a success and that the United States had detonated the world's first atomic bomb. The question was, what should be done with it? Truman called the nuclear weapon the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. Billions of dollars and thousands of man-hours had been spent on the development of the weapon, and now Truman needed to decide whether it would be used in the Pacific or locked away. Tokyo would have made sense as an initial target for the weapon of mass destruction, as it was the capital of Japan. However, other factors needed to be taken into consideration. First of all, the US needed to determine if they were even going to use the atomic bomb. There were 4 options under consideration for what would come next. Option 1. Continue the conventional bombing of Japanese cities instead of dropping the atomic bomb. Option 2. Invade Japan, knowing it would cost the lives of millions of people. Option 3. Conduct a demonstration of the atomic bomb on an uninhabited island. Option 4. Drop the atomic bomb on a Japanese city. As we know, Harry S. Truman and the United States military chose option 4. But what was the thought process behind the decision, and was Tokyo ever considered a target during the meetings? Let's look at each of the options a bit more in depth. Option 1. Conventional bombing. The United States had been bombing parts of the Japanese home islands for some time, but had only begun to really ramp up things around the middle of 1944. By the following year, it was estimated that 333,000 Japanese people were killed, with another 473,000 injured during U.S. air raids. The problem was that even though the U.S. was causing massive amounts of casualties and destruction on Japanese islands, they still refused to surrender. The thought of continuing business as usual and expecting a different result didn't seem to make sense at the time. Even after the Tokyo firebombing, which had the highest mortality rate of any single air attack in the war, the Japanese leadership still refused to surrender. This meant that Truman and his advisors needed another option. Conventional bombing did not seem to be working, even if it was causing massive amounts of damage. Instead, a single bomb that could obliterate an entire city might be just what the US needed. Therefore, the nuclear option was put on the table. By August 1945, the only viable option seemed to be either invading the Japanese home island or dropping the atomic bomb. Option 2. Invading Japan. An invasion of Japan seemed inevitable unless there was some sort of power shift in the war. The atomic bomb provided that catalyst. However, before the US even knew that the atomic bomb would successfully detonate if dropped from a plane, Truman and his advisors had to prepare for the very real option that boots would have to be put on the ground of the Japanese home islands. Unfortunately, over the course of several months, whenever US troops landed on Japanese-controlled islands, the enemy forces almost always refused to surrender. Entire units would fight to the very last man rather than give up, which inflicted massive casualties on both sides. It was suspected that if the United States invaded Japan, not only would the soldiers fight to the bitter end, but the general population would also refuse to give up. An invasion plan would end with the deaths of millions of troops and civilians, and it wasn't even clear if the US could take the home island successfully. A preview of how brutal the fighting would be if the US invaded was seen on Iwo Jima, when American soldiers attempted to take the island on February 19, 1945. In this battle, 6,200 U.S. soldiers died. Another 13,000 soldiers and sailors were killed on the Battle of Okinawa, which began on March 26th of the same year. The casualty rate on Okinawa was 35%, meaning 1 out of every 3 soldiers who engaged in the battle died or was wounded. Truman even voiced his concern about the invasion option by stating invading the main island would be like Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. The astonishing thing was that Harry Truman was almost certainly right. Documents discovered in Japan after the war ended suggested that Japan's plan for resistance was to have every soldier, civilian, and child fight against the Allied soldiers. The hope was to make the cost of taking the home island so high that the United States would give up and call for a ceasefire. This would then allow the Japanese to establish terms that would allow them to keep the territory they occupied at the time. When considering the invasion of Japan, Harry Truman wrote, "My object is to save as many American lives as possible, but I also have a human feeling for the women and children of Japan." Option 3. an atomic bomb demonstration. Scientists and military officials who were a part of the Manhattan Project were able to witness the awesome power of an atomic bomb firsthand when Gadget detonated at the Trinity test site. However, the rest of the world, including Emperor Hirohito, had no idea how powerful this weapon was. Therefore, it would have made sense to demonstrate its capabilities in the hopes that it would cause the Japanese leadership to surrender so the bomb would never have to be used in combat. When a demonstration was proposed on an uninhabited island where Japanese scientists and military leaders could see the explosion, it was shot down for several reasons. The first was because it was unclear who would be chosen to view the detonation and if they would have the ability to convince the Japanese leadership to surrender. Ideally, a panel of Japanese scientists and high-ranking military officers would have been chosen, but even then, it was unclear how long it would take for Japan to make a final decision about surrendering, and the US couldn't wait any longer to act. Then there was the very real possibility that when the Japanese saw the demonstration, they would double down on their war effort and ramp up production. They might even begin to construct countermeasures such as massive bunkers and increase anti-aircraft encampments to keep US planes that could be carrying the atomic bomb away from key locations. However, the biggest concern for the US was what would happen if the demonstration turned out to be a failure. What if they dropped one of the bombs and it didn't explode? It's important to remember that only one nuclear device had been successfully detonated at this point in time. It was not entirely clear if the success could be repeated, especially when the bomb was dropped from a plane and had to be triggered at a specific altitude. If the test itself was a failure, the Japanese might believe the US was desperate or worse, incompetent, and start to fight even harder. Then there was the fact that only 2 atomic bombs existed in the entire world. These would be the 2 bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If the United States detonated one in a demonstration, it would only have one left over if Japan refused to surrender. There were more bombs being produced, but at the time the decision to use nuclear weapons was being made, Harry Truman and his advisors only had the 2 on their way to Tinian Island to work with, and it would be a while before they had more. Some of the military advisors who were on the committee to decide what should be done warned that a demonstration would not be impressive enough to force a surrender. Instead, they stated, "We can propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We can see no acceptable alternative to direct military use." The Japanese needed to experience the destructive capabilities and mass casualties firsthand. All of these factors led to the US going with Option 4. Option 4. Drop the atomic bomb on Japan. It was suggested that perhaps the best way to use the bomb was to drop it in Tokyo Harbor. This would allow the Japanese leadership to see and experience the weapon's awesome power. However, most military advisors agreed this would not have the desired effect and concluded the bombs must be released over densely populated cities that met certain criteria. The first criteria was that target cities had to have suffered little or no damage from conventional bombing runs in the past. So it was clear the atomic blast was responsible for the destruction and casualties sustained after the detonation. The second criteria, and one that appeared to be less important, was that there should be some type of military production happening in the city. However, since workers' homes and entire neighborhoods were built around military factories, it would be impossible to find a strictly military target. These criteria eventually led to a short list of possible targets. The original list consisted of Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto. However, a substitute was made at the last moment and Kyoto was replaced with Nagasaki. We're going to examine exactly why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ultimately chosen, but it is worth noting that Tokyo was never actually on the list of possible cities to bomb. Later on, it would become apparent why this was the case, but suffice it to say, Tokyo didn't meet all the criteria outlined by the advisory board. In the final days before the atomic bombs were dropped, a committee made up of scientists including J. Robert Oppenheimer, politicians such as Henry Louis Stimson, who was also the Secretary of War, and generals like Leslie Groves, deliberated on how to best use the atomic bomb. On May 10th, the committee met to discuss several aspects of the bombs and which cities to target. Joyce C. Stearns, a scientist from the Air Force, told the rest of the committee the names of 4 locations that were on the short list of targets. At the time, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura had been chosen. Each were large urban areas of more than 3 miles in diameter, capable of being effectively damaged by the blast, and likely to be unattacked by next August. In the meeting, someone suggested bombing the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo, which would have sent a clear message to the Japanese leadership, but this plan was dismissed for several reasons that we'll get into later. It was decided that using the bomb must have 2 psychological effects along with destroying military facilities and infrastructure. The atomic bomb must scare the Japanese into surrendering, while simultaneously showing the rest of the world how powerful the United States' new weapon was. Really, what it came down to was that the bomb must cause a massive amount of damage and result in a staggering number of casualties. The committee believed that this would be the only way the Japanese leadership would surrender unconditionally, and since the US had been engaging in firebombing campaigns that wiped entire cities off the map, detonating an atomic bomb to level a key target seemed like the next logical step. Almost everyone on the committee agreed that Hiroshima would be a good first target, as it was compact, had military factories, and if the bomb were dropped directly in the middle of the urban center, it would end up destroying most, if not all, of the city. Hiroshima would show the true potential of the bomb and scare the Japanese population into submission. At least, that was what everyone hoped. Let's now look at where the 2 atomic bombs were actually dropped, how these locations were ultimately decided upon, and why Tokyo never made it onto the list of candidate cities and was therefore spared from a nuclear blast. After analyzing weather conditions, timing, and maps of Hiroshima, the orders were given to make the city the primary target. It was noted in reports that the city was the largest untouched target, which meant that any destruction done would be the direct result of the atomic blast. Hiroshima had a population of approximately 318,000 people and was an important depot and port of embarkation for Japan. The hills that surrounded the city were also thought to provide a focusing effect that would increase the blast damage. It had been decided earlier in the war that Hiroshima wasn't a very good target for firebombing, as the Ota River ran through it and would act as a firebreak. However, an atomic blast would have no problem decimating structures on both sides of the river. On August 6, 1945, at 9:15 a.m. and 15 seconds, Thomas Farabee announced "bomb away" over the Enola Gay's radio as a little boy was released from the belly of the plane and fell toward the Aoi Bridge in Hiroshima. At 9:16 and 2 seconds, the bomb detonated, 1,968 feet or 600 meters above the city. Estimates vary, but it's likely that between 70,000 and 100,000 people died in the initial blast. However, some estimates have this number closer to 140,000 deaths. For the scientists and military advisors choosing targets for the atomic bombs, Hiroshima was an obvious choice. However, the second city that would be hit if the Japanese didn't surrender after the first blast was hotly disputed by some. In fact, Nagasaki wasn't even supposed to be on the list of targets on August 9th. Through a series of unforeseen events, the people of Kyoto and Kokura were spared, and the population of Nagasaki was decimated by the Fat Boy atomic bomb. Kyoto had originally been chosen as the second target in Japan. It had a population of approximately 1 million and met almost all of the criteria that the committee had laid out. The city was a cultural and intellectual center as it once served as the ancient capital of the country. The downside was that Kyoto had no significant military installations. However, since the goal was to show the destructive power of the bomb and put the fear of God into the Japanese people, Kyoto remained high on the list of targets. Henry L. Stimson had traveled to Kyoto with his wife before the war and felt a personal connection to the city. He made it his mission to remove the former capital from the list of targets. Stimson argued that the atomic bomb should be used as a weapon of war in the manner prescribed by the laws of war and dropped on a military target. Kyoto did not meet these requirements. However, other than Stimson's objections, none of the other committee members saw dropping the atomic bombs on Japanese cities full of civilians as unethical or immoral, as this was war. Stimson met with General Groves and asked that Kyoto be removed from the list. Groves argued that Kyoto was large enough an area for us to gain complete knowledge of the effects of the atomic bomb. But on June 30th, Groves finally gave in and removed the former capital from the list of atomic bomb targets. On July 24, 1946, the day the official strike orders were issued, a handwritten note was attached to the list of targets that said, "And Nagasaki." This put the city in fourth-place position, which indicated it was least likely to be bombed. The reason that Nagasaki was chosen to replace Kyoto was because of its large shipbuilding industry and its importance as a trade center. There were also 2 munitions factories in the city, the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works and the Mitsubishi Urakami Torpedo Works. However, the hilly geography and the presence of a POW camp in the city made it less desirable than others on the list. When the B-29 named Boxcar took off from Tinian Island in the early hours of the morning of August 9th, its target was Kokura, which had been chosen because of the Japanese Imperial Army's massive arsenal located there. However, when the bomber arrived above the city at 10 a.m., clouds and bad weather obscured the ground below. The aircraft circled Kokura 3 times, looking for an opening, but the cloud cover never dissipated. Running low on fuel, Major Charles W. Sweeney decided to proceed to his alternate target of Nagasaki. The plane reached its destination but found the weather was just as bad, if not worse. Running out of time and fuel, Sweeney was about to order the plane to return to base without dropping its payload when an opening appeared in the clouds, and the city could be seen below. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Boy was dropped over Nagasaki and detonated. This was a larger bomb than had been dropped on Hiroshima and produced an explosion with more than 21 kilotons of power, killing as many as 40,000 to 70,000 people and leveling the city. Less than a week later, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced the Japanese people would be surrendering to the United States, signaling the beginning of the end of World War II in the Pacific. But what about Tokyo? What specific reasons did the committee have for omitting the capital of the Japanese Empire from their list of targets? The first was that Tokyo housed many of Japan's military and government leaders. Since the bombs were to be dropped without warning, the blast could kill key members of the Japanese administration, thereby causing a breakdown in command. If this were to happen, the surrender might actually have been delayed as power shifted within the government. The United States was looking for a quick end to the war and still needed a functioning Japanese government to negotiate with. An atomic bomb dropped on Tokyo might have ended up prolonging the war. But the main reason why Tokyo was not considered a target for the atomic bombs was because the city was already in ashes from the deadliest bombing runs of the war. On the night of March 9th and into March 10th, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers flew from the Mariana Islands to Tokyo. The codename for this mission was Operation Meeting House, and many military leaders hoped the attack would force the Japanese to surrender. The B-29s had conducted bombing runs in Japan before, and they'd even unleashed a fiery hell on other cities, but this time, things were different. General Curtis LeMay had been newly appointed as the head of the B-29 operations in the region. He noticed that in past missions, where bombers dropped their payloads from high altitudes, they were incredibly inaccurate. The planes were more protected high up, but they were ineffective at such high altitudes. In fact, their accuracy was less than 10%. Therefore, on the night of Operation Meeting House, LeMay ordered the fleet of airships to descend from 30,000 feet to 7,000 feet. As they approached Tokyo, the B-29s broke formation and fell into a single-file line. The decision to bomb the city at night resulted in Japanese fighters being unprepared and made it more difficult for the bombers to be spotted by anti-aircraft guns. To increase speed, maneuverability, and payload size, the bombers had been stripped of all non-essential components, including guns and gunners. This allowed them to be loaded with more bombs, but left the aircraft completely defenseless. However, on the night of March 9th, this didn't matter. The 334 bombers met very little resistance as they approached their targets. These B-29s were not just loaded with regular ordnances. Instead, they carried napalm-filled incendiary bombs that were designed to create a firestorm in the city below. United States military strategists knew that Japan, and Tokyo in particular, constructed most of its buildings using wood and were tightly packed together. This meant that once the bombs went off, the city would ignite, and there would be no stopping the fire from burning its way across the city. U.S. strategists marked 3 key locations in Tokyo that needed to be hit, as they were the most flammable sectors and would cause the largest fire. Army engineers had actually created a mock Japanese village where they tested setting fires in order to figure out the best combination of explosives and napalm. The model Japanese village was constructed in Dugway Proving Ground in Utah and served as an important preparation tool before the bombing run. By the time Operation Meeting House began, the engineers knew that Tokyo would burn to the ground that night. Between March 9th and March 10th, 15 square miles or nearly 40 square kilometers were consumed by flames. At the time, Tokyo was one of the most densely packed cities in the entire world. The fire raged for nearly 4 days, leaving more than 1 million people homeless. Reports that came out after the Tokyo firebombing were horrific. In some places, the flames were so intense that canals began to boil. Metal frames melted, and men, women, and children caught in the fire burst into flames. When the operation was over, 1,667 tons of napalm-filled incendiary bombs had been dropped on Tokyo. Some historians have argued that the firebombing of Tokyo was the single deadliest airstrike of the entire war, and that it likely caused more death and destruction than either of the atomic bombs. More than 100,000 people died in the firebombing, and hundreds of thousands more suffered from third-degree burns and disfigurement. Just as a comparison, the firebombing of Dresden in Germany resulted in 25,000 deaths, which at the time seemed unfathomable. So this brings us back to the question of why didn't the United States bomb Tokyo? The simplest explanation is that there was nothing left to bomb. The entire city had been burnt to the ground as a result of Operation Meeting House, which meant that it didn't meet the criteria of being relatively untouched by other attacks. The population had been decimated, and the city was little more than charred piles of wood. If an atomic bomb had been dropped on Tokyo, it would have created a massive mushroom cloud and blown a ton of debris outward from its epicenter, but it wouldn't have shown off the weapon's destructive power. At that point, the bomb would have only affected the already injured population, and it wouldn't have really disrupted the Japanese military as there were few factories or military buildings still operational in the city. So the main reason an atomic bomb wasn't dropped on Tokyo was because of the firebombing of the city 5 months prior. It's estimated that the total civilian casualties in Japan as a result of Allied air attacks was around 806,000. Of these casualties, 330,000 people died. Japan also suffered another 780,000 combat casualties due to American bombing runs. Not every Japanese target would have been as affected by a firebombing run as Tokyo was, just like not every city would have suffered as much death and destruction as Nagasaki and Hiroshima did due to the atomic bomb. US strategists meticulously decided on targets and attack methods where the most destruction could be done and fear could be instilled in the Japanese people. Even though these actions are controversial and can be debated, the result was that the Japanese surrendered unconditionally to the United States after the atomic bombs were dropped. Although it is worth mentioning that the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan and the Red Army barreling through East Asia also played a role in Japan's decision to surrender. Now watch Atomic Bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki minute by minute, or check out The Truth About Why America Dropped Atomic Bombs on Japan.